Hello everyone, my name is Monica Rickards. Today I will be reading to you Fancy Nancy by Jane O'Connor. This book is appropriate for second graders who are building their vocabulary and also have a pretty good intake on their sight words. Let's begin. Fancy Nancy. I love being fancy. My favorite color is fuchsia. That's a fancy way of saying purple. I like to write my name with a pen that has a plume. That's a fancy way of saying feather. And I can't wait to learn French because everything in French sounds fancy. Nobody in my family is fancy at all. They never even ask for sprinkles. There's a lot they don't understand. Lace-trimmed socks do help me play soccer better. Sandwiches definitely taste better when you stick in Philly toothpicks. A princess is supposed to keep her tiara on. What's a fancy girl to do? I asked my doll Maribel. Her full name is Maribel Lavinia Chandelier. Then I get an idea that is stupendous. That's a fancy word for great. Maybe I can teach my family how to be fancy. I make an ad and stick it on the fridge. Soon there is a knock on my door. My family saw the ad. They want to get started right away. The trouble is, my family doesn't own any fancy clothes. That's okay. I go find, what is that fancy word? Oh yes, some accessories. Ooh la la, my family is posh. That's a fancy word for fancy. My mom twirls in front of the mirror. Why don't we go somewhere fancy tonight? How about dinner at the King's Crown? My dad suggests. Wow, my pants are acting fancier already. May I escort you lovely ladies outside? The limousine is waiting. My dad is our chauffeur. That's a fancy word for driver. When we arrive at the King's Crown, everyone looks up. They probably think we're movie stars. I am so proud of my whole family. They eat with their pinkies up and call each other darling. For dessert, let's have parfaits, my mom says. That's French for ice cream sundaes. Amazing! My mother knows French. When our parfaits are ready, I curtsy and say, merci. I carry the tray like a fancy waiter. Oops! I trip. I slip. The tray does a double flip. I don't feel fancy anymore. I want to go home. After I get all cleaned up, I put on my dressing gown. Those are fancy words for bathrobe. I feel much better. I'm ready for a parfait. I tell my parents, thank you for being fancy tonight. I love you, my dad says. I love you, my mom says. And all I say back is I love you. Because there isn't a fancy or better way of saying that. Now, as I read Fancy Nancy, I used 5 categories of expressive engagement. The first was dramatizing. As I read this story, I used expression and excitement, which engaged the children. I also used the engagement category of talking back. I would encourage my students to talk and interact with me, such as when I would ask questions as, how do you think Fancy Nancy felt when she dropped her tray? Or, what are some categories of fancy and not fancy that you can compare like Fancy Nancy did in the story with her mother and father? I also use the category of critiquing and controlling. I directly ask questions to my students. I also inserted the children into the story and allowed them to do that with themselves. They would read the story back to me as what I had just read. I also allowed them to talk over me. I accepted their responses and their questions and didn't deny their answers. Now, 3 critical thinking strategies that I believe help the students engage and that they can use while reading this story would be number 1, strategy 1, exploring underlying feelings and thoughts. This would pertain to how Fancy Nancy felt when she dropped her tray, which of course was sadness, maybe embarrassment, and also as an outsider. She said she didn't feel fancy anymore, and that she also was ready to actually go back to the comfort of her own home. Strategy number 19 says critical problem solvers use everything available to them to find the best solution that they possibly can. Fancy Nancy did this in the story when she decided to give her parents lessons on how to become fancy and compared the 2 categories of what was fancy and what wasn't. The students might have come up with other solutions that Fancy Nancy could have used besides the lessons. Strategy number 29 says critical thinkers strive to treat similar things similarly and differently things differently. The students, as they listen to the story or as they read the story independently, could compare how Fancy Nancy lives her life and what she believes is fancy and how they actually live their lives and what their opinion on what fancy is. Now, some other books that may be of interest from this same author, Miss Jane O'Connor, would be some of her picture books. She does have 15 other picture books with Fancy Nancy as the narrator available for purchase online. She also has 5 chapter books that are for readers ready for that next step that are titled Nancy Clancy and also involve Fancy Nancy as the narrator. There are also 21 I Can Read Level 1 titles that are perfect for students ready to start their reading independently at that beginning 1st grade level. Now, I would like to show you the cover of Fancy Nancy. This cover is very important because it shows Fancy Nancy, the actual narrator and the main character, and her personality is shown through this little outfit that she has on. Now, the back cover is also of interest to me because it says, "No one knows Fancy like Nancy." This is the story of the part where she is teaching her parents how to be fancy and the 2 categories that she uses of plain and fancy, and teaches her family the different comparisons. Now, I also like to show you the illustration of when Fancy Nancy slips. Here is when her tray does that big double flip. Of course, you can see the chaos coming through her face. You can also see here some of her emotions and how she's feeling, and students can relate to this as they also experience some of these same realistic emotions on a daily basis. Now, some of the character traits of Fancy Nancy are obviously that she believes bigger is better and everything fancier is better. But as the story changes, especially after that trip to the King's Crown, she soon learns that it's actually the comfort of her home that means the most to her, and that her family doesn't have to be fancy to necessarily be similar to her. She also learns that being fancy isn't what really life is all about, that you can just be yourself and still be okay. Now, I'd like to describe the setting of the story, which obviously takes place in the comfort of Nancy's home, and that's a big deal in this story. Nancy feels comfortable at home, and she feels like she can be her expression of fancy at home. And when she goes outside, we learn that, of course, outsiders look differently in her family, and that they don't exactly fit in. And so if this story was in a different type of setting, I don't think it would actually relate to the lesson of home and the importance of family as much as it does. Thank you very much for allowing me to share, and I hope you enjoyed.